my first question is to Marilla herself, and that is, how did she begin this long journey in life of being Dymphna Cusack's biographer? Where did that interest come from? How long has it been with her? And what's its evolution to this book?
I guess the formal beginning would have to be when Julie James Bailey recruited me at the Film and Television School, which was then in a factory in North Ryde, not its illustrious present site, to work with her as a researcher, mainly because I'd had a fairly substantial input training in market research for the advertising world, and she and I both wanted to put that period into good social justice cause. And so I worked with her and a mob of great women on the making of Come In Spinner as a novel and turning it into what was then intentioned as a film, but which became a television mini-series broadcast on the ABC in 1989. So that was a 10-year journey. 1979, I first sat on the floor at Abbotsford Julie at their knees, and they talked, Florence James, Julie's mum, and Dymphna Cusack. They yarned together about how they had worked in Hazelbrook in the Blue Mountains at the end of the Second World War to create a novel which told the seamy side of Sydney, in truth, in the Second World War, and they were no holds barred. They certainly revealed all the rackets, all the gambling, all the prostitution, child prostitution not accepted. It was in there too. They were very, very gutsy in what they decided to put out into the world as the novel Come In Spinner. And so 10 years were spent on that quest between 1979 and 1989, and Dymphna unfortunately had a stroke after the second time I met her, and could no longer be interviewed. But Florence was there all the time with her living memories over the entire decade and later. And that was the journey that led to my going to Wollongong University with Dr. Paul, as he hates me saying, and doing an MA Honours thesis on the anatomy of the bestseller, The Making of Come In Spinner. But as life went on, and it's been 38 years now since that journey began, that part of the journey began. Back at high school, I had been given a copy of Southern Steel by Dymphna to read in my HSC. Well, it wasn't HSC year. I predate HSC. It was a leaving certificate year in 1962. And the novel Southern Steel had been an eye-opener to me. I was a friend of Anne Curthoy's, who was Jeff Curthoy's, Barbara Curthoy's in particular. She was very active in politics within the Indigenous community. And I was very, very close to them. And I'd go after school and I would learn from them what was happening in a bigger world than when I ever knew in suburban Newcastle in the 1950s and 60s. And Southern Steel, when I read it, was a gobsmacker, because back then in 1962, my leaving certificate year, it revealed to me the Newcastle that explained my parents, that explained the world in which I had grown up, which was the consequences of the Second World War in an industrial city which was caste and class divided, where, like my grandfather, the protagonist in Southern Steel comes out of a coal mine background. My dad's father was killed down a mine. And the story then moves into the aspirational generation in which I grew up in Newcastle, where my father had become a top executive at the steelworks and was overseas swanning half the year. But the rest of the family were left not exactly still down the pit, but certainly close to the pit head. And that was a big eye-opener. And I went back to Southern Steel after the work with Spinner and Julie at the film school, and I started reading the rest of Dymphna's novels. And to tell you the truth, I was on her wavelength. I mean, she was probably the person who explained to me the injustices of society. And John and Sue both know. They came into the story very early. John Grant down here and Sue, Dymphna's first his nephew from her sister B. And they revealed to me, well, John in particular, telling me how Dymphna had taken the story of his mum, B. Crowley, née Crowley, B. Grant, she married Randall Grant, and had used the life of his mum, which was a tragic life. It was a life that involved alcoholism treated as a criminality. And Dymphna wrote a book that was going to, and did, blast the medical profession out of the water for the absolutely disgustingly mechanistic operations that they performed on a generation or two of people with tuberculosis, when everybody with any brains and any overseas connections knew that streptomycin had been available during the Second World War and that it would kill the bug. But Dymphna had to write this book with the help of the Millises, which were a quite famous family in the Blue Mountains. And Dymphna, of course, started that novel in the Blue Mountains, as she and Florence wrote Come In Spinner in the Blue Mountains, as I wrote this book in the Blue Mountains, and as it is being published by Blue Mountains Publishers. So it's very proudly and unashamedly made in the Blue Mountains.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Marilla.